Thank you everybody for being here. I'm a journalist, so I'm going to just run through a few points about how media treats exchange rate and how they report on exchange rate. Um, like for example, what we are usually told, a lot of turmoil in Asia about currencies, but actually the currency moves in only some countries. Like in Hong Kong, it doesn't move at all. Um, okay. So we have, the media gives all kinds of reasons why currencies fall, like oil prices, and these are some examples: slowing growth, capital flows, risk appetites. These are all examples of international media. So this is one day, February 18th, currencies fall because of optimism and stimulus. February 19th, currencies slip on anxiety. And this commodities is a kind of a perennial thing. Media is fascinated with this stuff. So they say commodities go up because of currencies go up because of commodities. So what media and even other people usually don't ask is why many of these commodity rich countries currencies collapse, and even though they do have it. And trade deficit is a big favorite among media. Imports, and now of course it's the current account deficit because there's a lot of services trade. And when you ask about why don't some currencies fall, so people say, okay, these countries are small, and when you ask like why didn't the Chinese currency fall from 93 to like 2005, they say China is a big country, therefore it doesn't fall. So I don't know what they say now when after 2005 when they let the currency go. So all kinds of reasons are given. So analysts, media, economies, foreign exchange strategists, they all give all kinds of reasons, usually real economic reasons, and central banks are not mentioned. Monetary policy is not mentioned. Usually you see a few reports as soon as rates are hiked, they'll say then couple of weeks later it's all gone. So the media also does not understand that there are different types of monetary regimes which work in like completely different ways. They apply the same kind of rules to all. And they also give these like labels. They say, oh, Hong Kong has a peg, Sri Lanka has a peg, or some other country has a peg, or a flexible exchange rate, or whatever it is. But actually, they are not the same. So, like things like currency boards are understood by nobody. I work for an international media organization as well. And there's a wide, nobody really knows. So they have different ways of writing about it, but they don't really understand. For example, this is just one thing. This is the morning currency update of a major financial news file. Hong Kong dollar is the 13th most traded currency in the world, and in Asia it's one of the biggest. But it doesn't come in the morning update. Currencies that trade in smaller volumes are mentioned. That's because it doesn't really move. It's not news. So it's all under the radar. So if you have a kind of what's called a soft peg or something which moves and collapses and so on, it makes news. So, and people really don't know whether there are. Hong Kong is like it's as it's a almost orthodox currency board, and there are others like in Macau and even there are a couple of one currency which is linked to in Brunei has a currency board with Hong Kong dollar. So people say in Sri Lanka always the big story is the trade deficit. Trade deficit is why therefore no currency falls. So for example, Hong Kong has a trade deficit all the time. Currency board, the exchange rate doesn't move. Their current account deficit moves from surplus to deficit, for years at a time. Nothing happens. So the problem with media is that we talk to analysts and they tell us something. We talk to economists, so they tell us something, and we repeat it, and we also listen to central bank, and whatever they say, also we repeat. So the media is supposed to be like very critical, and if you find a pickpocket or somebody who steals your money or destroys your savings, you don't listen to him. You will question it. You will listen to the police, for example, but you don't apply the same logic to central bank. And if you look at the past, you will see that before central bank became government agencies, when they were privately owned, there's a lot of media scrutiny. Before the Second World War on England in the 1800s, there are a lot of scrutiny. But the media has basically kind of ignored central banks in this issue. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Asantha. And now for the keynote speech, I would invite Dr. Ross McCleod, Associate Professor of the Australian National University.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. I should start out by saying that I know almost nothing about Sri Lanka, but I do know a little bit about Indonesia by virtue of working on Indonesia for several decades. And it turns out that Indonesia has kind of similar problems when it comes to the balance of payments that I think Sri Lanka has experienced, and so I guess that's why I'm standing here talking to you about it today. So the sort of boring title for my address is Managing the Balance of Payments, but just to make it a little bit more interesting for you, I thought I'd talk about economists' love-hate relationship with Adam Smith. I note that in this conference there are at least 2 or 3 people who belong to organizations called something like Adam Smith Institute, and I know that free market people are very big fans of Adam Smith, as am I. I also have a private company which is called Ricardo Smith Proprietary Limited, so I think that helps to establish my credentials to be here. So I'm going to start out, I'm going to sort of set the basis for this discussion in terms of Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand. Economic activity involves thousands of different production functions and millions of utility functions. For those of you who are not economists, what we mean by a production function is simply the technological relationship between how much you can produce with particular combinations of inputs of land and labour and capital. And utility functions are what we use to describe individuals' preferences for all the goods and services that they want to consume. So on the one hand, an economy contains thousands, hundreds of thousands of firms with their production functions, and in an economy such as Sri Lanka, there are many millions of people with their utility functions or preferences for goods and services. So how do we coordinate all of these firms and individuals or individual consumers? Well, this happens by way of those firms and consumers offering to buy and to sell goods and services and assets. And their supply schedules and their demand schedules interact in such a way as to determine prices of whatever it is that's being traded. And in turn, the prices determine the allocation of productive resources to different activities, the distribution or consumption of goods and services amongst countless individuals, and the ownership of assets. So it seems to me that Adam Smith came up with a very memorable metaphor for markets. It's just as though there was some omniscient authority controlling this extremely complicated organisational process with an invisible hand. Now, there's a problem with this. No, let me step back from there. At any given time, or with any given set of economic circumstances, there is a set of correct or right answers to questions like what gets produced and how, who gets to consume what and how much, who gets to own what. Right, so that's what is going on with the invisible hand. We arrive at these correct or right answers by way of signals given by prices in markets. And the function of those prices is to balance supply and demand. And although we do have some concerns about the distribution of income, I think broadly speaking, economists are pretty happy with Smith's clever metaphor explaining how economies function. However, there's always a but. What about the self-interest of economists? If the invisible hand kind of sorts everything out, then why do we need economists? I don't know how many economists there are in the room, but I don't know if you've ever asked yourself this question, but it seems to me if you believe in the invisible hand, then you've got to ask yourself that question. Well, what do I do then? In fact, we often don't need economists. And a case in point is the comparison between a currency board and a central bank. It's certainly feasible to have a fully functioning economy without a central bank if you have a currency board. Sri Lanka itself has done this in the past and did so quite successfully as far as I'm aware. So there's almost no need for economists to run a currency board. As you know, all a currency board does is act like a teller's window. Somebody comes to you with some foreign exchange, you buy it at a set price. If alternatively somebody comes to you with local currency and wants to buy foreign currency, you sell it at a set price. It's pretty easy. You don't really need an economics degree to run a currency board. Nevertheless, in Sri Lanka, I understand that some foreign advisors, perhaps from the United States, persuaded the government that having a central bank in Sri Lanka rather than a currency board would be advantageous. And just as an aside, I believe that one of those advisors ended up with the job of governor of the central bank when it was first established. Now, I'm not saying that he gave that advice because he wanted that job, but I do think it's plausible to argue that economists argue for these kinds of institutions and arrangements because it kind of justifies the existence of economists. It gives us something to do. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to running the monetary system of a country, you don't need a central bank, you don't even need a currency board. If you want to, you can use the currency of some other country. So several countries use the United States dollar as their currency. There's even one or two countries that use the Australian dollar as their currency. So just imagine if you do that. There's a whole lot of economists that you don't need to employ because you've agreed that you don't need to have a central bank. So it seems to me that often we, the economics profession, are not entirely objective when we argue the need for government intervention and for economists to design and implement that intervention. Collectively, we're pretty good at arguing that the invisible hand gets it wrong, oftentimes. In other words, there's a market failure here, there's a market failure there, and all of these market failures need to be fixed. And guess what? You need an economist to tell you how to fix it. So it seems to me many in the economics profession are actually no great fans of Adam Smith. I can never get a job as a consultant because my answer to almost every question is, why would a government want to do that? The market will solve this problem, you know. That's why I'm perennially unemployed. Now, having talked about the invisible hand and how it organises economic activity for us, let's ask the question, what happens when the right changes that we determined yesterday, what happens when those change? And the reality of life is economic circumstances are constantly changing. And therefore, the set of right answers to all of those questions are changing also. Whatever was correct yesterday is typically not going to be correct today. And every price change that you can imagine, because there's a buyer and a seller, it's good for one party, but it's bad for the other. Price increases benefit sellers, but they harm buyers. Conversely, price decreases harm sellers, but benefit buyers. And this is where politics intrudes. The losers from any prospective or actual price change typically are going to put pressure on governments to intervene on their side. Thank you. And they can always think of plausible arguments to justify a preference for the status quo ante. In other words, they'll say, well, the price yesterday, the price that affected me was such, and that was the right price. And I deserve to have that price going forward. It's not fair if that price changes against me. And they're very good at sort of boosting up the alleged harm that will be done to them if the price changes. They're also very good at downplaying the negative impact of the proposed interventions on other parties, or pretending that there is no impact. Please control this price, don't let this price change, it'll kill me, but it doesn't matter to anybody else. Or that's basically the sort of argument. That's what spin doctoring is all about. It's what public relations is all about. It's what political lobbying is all about. But the new right set of prices that would otherwise emerge would typically maximise national income given the new economic circumstances. If we believe in the invisible hand to work out the right prices on one day, then it will still work out the right prices on another day, and it will do so in such a way that reflects any change in economic circumstances that has occurred. Politically engineered intervention is rarely in the national interest. I apologise for my voice, and excuse me while I just take a swig of this. So what's the relevance of all of this to macroeconomic policy? Now I'm getting into the thing that I was asked to talk to you about. Well, the exchange rate and the interest rate are just prices. They serve the same organising or coordinating function as all other prices. And to me, it is simply intellectual arrogance to imagine that the economist, the bureaucrat, the policymaker knows better than the collective wisdom of the market what these prices should be. Frankly, I don't think our macroeconomic models are nearly good enough to be able to tell you what is the correct level for the exchange rate on any given day of the week. Yet that is the way it is in most countries, including Indonesia that I work on, and Sri Lanka, where we are today. So professional economists, it seems to me, play into the hands of those who want the government on their side by arguing that there is something wrong with the market-determined outcomes that requires intervention. So let me quickly present a small number of examples from Indonesia, and I hope that you'll see the relevance of these to Sri Lanka and other Asian countries. The first example I'll take was the formation of Opec. This had a very big impact in Indonesia in the early 1970s because Indonesia has oil resources, and there was a tremendous surge in the world oil price in the early 1970s as a consequence of OPEC, the OPEC cartel. So suddenly Indonesia had a boom in exports, a balance of payments surplus. But to benefit from that boom fully, it means that productive resources needed to shift to other sectors, especially other tradables sectors. This should and would occur automatically by virtue of the invisible hand. It's very simple and straightforward. Suddenly the supply of foreign exchange exceeds the demand for it, assuming we started off from equilibrium. The price falls, in other words, the exchange rate appreciates. Pre-existing tradables production becomes less profitable as a consequence of the appreciated exchange rate. And if you let the market work, then resources will shift into the new export sector, that is the oil boom sector, right? So if the price has gone up, then let's produce more oil and cash in on that. But resources will also shift into the production of non-tradables. We don't need to produce so many import substitutes. We don't need to produce so many exports as we were doing yesterday. So we can use our productive resources to produce non-tradables. But the government was reluctant to yield to the invisible hand at that time. It was trying to avoid what we think of these days as the Dutch disease. They wanted to avoid the negative impact on existing tradables production. And so Bank Indonesia, the central bank, prevented a market adjustment of the exchange rate. In other words, it stood in the way of appreciation. Now that's all very well. A central bank can do that in the short term by simply entering the foreign exchange market and buying up the excess supply of foreign exchange. But the impact of that inevitably is to increase the supply of base money, because if the central bank is going to buy foreign exchange, then it has to pay for that, and it pays for it in terms of base money, its own monetary liability. And the increase in the supply of base money to the economy at that time naturally resulted in inflation. As one of my heroes, Milton Friedman, once said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So, as sure as day follows night, the increased supply of base money at that time caused higher inflation in Indonesia. And so when we look at the real exchange rate, we find that it appreciated. Even though the nominal rate was held constant, the fact that domestic prices were increasing, that meant that the real exchange rate appreciated. And of course, it's the real exchange rate that matters to economic outcomes, not the nominal rate. So this demonstrates an important point, and that is that central banks really have only one instrument of policy, and that is the supply of base money. And that being the case, it follows that they can only control one nominal variable, the exchange rate or the price level, but not both of those things simultaneously. Second example I'd like to give you from Indonesia was its experience during the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s. And this demonstrates a related but equally important point. Just as a central bank cannot control more than one nominal variable, it must control one variable, precisely one, no more and certainly no less. So what happens if the central bank doesn't control any variable? This pretty exactly describes the situation in Indonesia in 1997. Up until the time of the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia's de facto policy was to run a steady rate of depreciation of the currency. This was never announced formally, but if you look back over the data, you will find that for many years, the exchange rate depreciated within a fairly narrow band of 3 to 5% per annum. So that was effectively the nominal anchor for monetary policy at that time. Just as an aside, they also had an inflation target of 5% or lower but they almost never achieved that target. Inflation always came in higher than the target. At the beginning of the Asian financial crisis, as of August of 1997, Indonesia was suddenly faced with this quite heavy speculation against its currency, and so it decided, what a good idea if we float the exchange rate. And I, amongst other people, said, yes, that'd be a good idea. That'd be a simple solution to your problem. The only problem was that they did that without adopting any alternative nominal anchor. So previously, the nominal anchor was a steady rate of depreciation. Now they dropped that policy, but there was no substitute policy. And as a consequence of that, the rate of growth of base money, M0, went out of control. It did so because the central bank was heavily involved in last resort lending because all of the banks were in trouble. And the problem was that they were injecting money by lending to the banks, but they weren't sterilising that in any way. And so liquidity was just being pumped into the economy at a very rapid rate. The predictable consequence of this is that a lot of that money was used to speculate against the currency. In other words, the central bank itself was providing the funds with which people could speculate against the currency. And the second and third elements of this were that the excess liquidity caused inflation to increase very rapidly, and as a consequence of that, nominal interest rates also spiked. I think it's called the Fisher effect. People expect inflation, and so therefore they require high nominal rates of interest to compensate for that. So all of those bad things happened, and if you do a comparative study of Indonesia versus countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines and so on, and Korea, you'll find that Indonesia alone had that huge burst of inflation, huge depreciation of the currency, huge spike of nominal interest rates. The third example I'll give you again from Indonesia is this time the global financial crisis in 2008. As you'll recall, there was a sudden upheaval in the global financial markets which seemed to threaten Indonesia. But this time, the policy response was just totally different from what it had been in 1997 in the Asian financial crisis. First of all, the growth of base money was held fairly steady. The exchange rate was permitted to depreciate, and there was a bit of intervention by the central bank, but not very much. And interest rates were also permitted to increase. And as a consequence of all of this, Indonesia was able to pretty much sail through the global financial crisis almost without damage. There was a minor downturn in the growth rate. It might have been from 6% to 4% for a little while, or something of that order. Not a really bad result at all. By comparison, in the Asian financial crisis, the growth rate in Indonesia, if you can believe this, became negative at about 13% year on year. At one stage it was even negative 19%. But the experience in the global financial crisis was just totally different. Now, why is that so? Well, let's just think about speculation against the currency. Suddenly, for whatever reason, people expect the exchange rate to depreciate. Okay, that might be damaging for me, or I might just see it as an opportunity to make a profit. But if enough people think there's going to be depreciation, then you start buying foreign currency. And if the central bank holds the exchange rate at what it had been, more and more people will buy. But if you allow the exchange rate to move suddenly, then it's already happened. You've missed the boat. You can't make a profit anymore because the price change has already happened. Speculation only makes you a profit if you can get in first and beat everybody else to it. But if you allow the exchange rate to move automatically, as it would if you leave things to the invisible hand, then you automatically remove that speculative element. So my basic point is that we like the idea of the invisible hand. You know, markets organise things for us very nicely. But the point is that economic circumstances are changing by the minute, by the day, by the week. This is inevitable, right? It could be natural things, it could be political things, it could be whatever. Economic circumstances are changing all the time, and therefore the right set of prices is changing all the time. And in my view, it's the authorities' unwillingness to let keep prices adjust to these new circumstances that generates instability. So the sort of Keynesian notion is that you have clever economists / bureaucrats running the economy. They concern themselves all the time with the private sector doing things that generate instability. And so they say, well, we can offset that instability by changing the money growth rate or changing interest rates or changing the budgetary settings and so on. Well, that's all very nice in theory, but I think it doesn't really work in practice. On the contrary, the government itself, the authorities themselves, including the central bank, tend to be the major source of instability rather than the solution to that problem. So just to conclude, I would say that Asian countries, including Sri Lanka and Indonesia, that have depreciated in recent times, may be a little bit worse off than they were before. But it's important to realise that that is not the consequence of the depreciation itself, it's the consequence of the changing circumstances which made that depreciation necessary. Specifically, in recent times, you've had global interest rates rising. Well, that's a change in any country's circumstances if you're engaged in the international capital market. If the circumstances change, you've got to change along with that, and it might make you, the change in circumstances might make you worse off, but the depreciation does not do so. The depreciation is only the appropriate response to the changing circumstances. So, prices need to adjust to deteriorating circumstances in order to minimise the reduction in living standards, but don't blame the change in prices for any reduction in living standards. Preventing price adjustments for the benefit of the few, and it's always for the benefit of the few, whatever story might be told, that makes the population as a whole worse off. Bottom line, trust the invisible hand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ross McCleod. I'd now like to invite our speakers for the public talk, Dr. Ross McCleod, Dr. Cris Lingle, and Dr. Ajay Shah to take their seats. This panel will be moderated by Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, the CEO of JB Securities.
He wants to give a presentation. Go ahead. No.
Okay, well, I probably will repeat quite a bit of what we just said. I may try to add some other embellishments here. And what I saw, we're having a similar debate on this issue in Guatemala, where I'm a professor. Now, there are the depreciationists that are primarily people in the export sector, industrialists who want to see currency depreciate as a mechanism for boosting economic growth. Okay. Now, this is what I would call, what call economic fallacies, or we could call them like zombies. These are ideas that are very difficult to kill. We're stuck with these. Central planning is one that's coming back in China in many ways. It's becoming romanticized again. Minimum wages are this illusion that politicians dream up as a way of getting political support. Primarily, it supposedly provides a living wage. It does nothing of the sort. It virtually guarantees a zero wage for very low productivity workers, and so on, all of these things. And of course, foreign exchange, tampering with foreign exchange is a way of promoting economic growth. Is it being recorded or? Okay. I'm sorry. Let's look at it. Now, I'm going to make a few distinctions here. Devaluations occur when you have a fixed exchange rate, a peg. So most countries don't have that any longer. This is always a policy choice. So devaluation or revaluation of a currency is a policy choice, a movement away from a fixed exchange rate. Now, depreciation could be natural, that is market-driven, or it could be induced. So what I'm going to reflect on, and what Professor McCleod reflected on, is what I would call induced depreciation. This occurs with a floating exchange rate, which most countries have today, with the exception of those with a currency board or dollarized economies. So in this case, the monetary authority makes I would say a political rather than economic decision, because economics would tell you don't need to do this. Good economics would tell you that, I would suggest. So, and the primary mechanism for doing that is by inflating the currency. That is, increasing liquidity through the banking system, or running the printing presses, which is less likely, but expanding the balance sheet of the central bank. So these political modifications that we see, the first one would be some misplaced belief in a growth model that inducing depreciation will actually promote economic growth and create prosperity. The idea of the Dutch disease, which he mentioned, is where you have a dominant export sector, for example, in Indonesia, petroleum in particular, or previously in the Netherlands, where you have this unanticipated and unexpected inflows, sort of a windfall and external shock that puts upward pressures on exchange rate. So this often will alarm politicians, some economists, and central bankers to get involved. Now, it's really economic alchemy, or Keynesianism, if you want to put it in another more technical phrase. Just like the idea of a Keynesian expenditure multiplier. These are like Elvis sightings. They're just about as real as the sightings of Elvis. Now, we see economists, macroeconomists coming up with estimates of these all the time. They tend to be very small and under very tortured conditions with respect to the data. So, because in fact, what happens is that we will see no net increase in jobs. One sector will be benefited, the export sector, which in many countries, even in countries that are open trading economies, the export sector will be a small component of the total economy. Most people are employed in the domestic sector, that is the non-tradable sector. So it does change relative prices, and it'll change domestic relative prices, which changes the specialization pattern, as Professor McCleod pointed out, so that we see that the production structure is distorted through this mechanism. Eventually, it's going to lead to price inflation. And when I began developing a presentation, one of my earlier ideas was to focus on the idea of social justice. That is, the absence of sound money, that is the inability of central banks to protect the value of their currencies, which is their primary goal. It is an injustice, primarily because, as we all know, anyone that studied economics, price inflation primarily hurts the poor. It also cheats workers. This is unjust. So workers that believe initially that they're earning more than their actual purchasing power of their income and wages are cheated in that regard. So this is really a public choice game. I mean, the reason we do need economists
is explained by public choice. We need a good economist to explain why the bad ones are telling governments to do stupid things. So thank God, you know. That's why I have a job, happily, I believe. So, because it's all about interest groups. Democracy has become a corrosive mechanism of forced redistribution. Taxation was never originally conceived as a redistributive tool. It's become that through these public choice mechanisms. And this is one of the great failures of modern democracy. So it's really a subsidy of the export sector. This is unjust. The rule of law, if we believe in that as a cornerstone of democracy, the rule of law means no privileges. No privileges means no subsidies. Subsidies are an injustice. They're an arbitrary decision based on politics. What do I do? Okay. So we see the export sector will have this momentary boom until price inflation appears, the adjustment take place, and the sectoral crisis may or may not follow. So the other thing, and I think this is implicit in your remarks, the trade balance is not the most important economic indicator. Much more important economic indicators are, the rise in per capita income, the impacts on overall standard of living, and the trade balance may or may not have that big of an impact on those. The way we get economic development is primarily from gains in structural competitiveness, and this is not through monetary leisure-demand. It's like playing around with the money supply. Playing around with money supply is not the answer. The answer is going to be and anyway, every monetary shortcut that is tried and is tried time and time again leads to more problems than solutions. And primarily in price inflation, distorted production structures, and these injustices I mentioned. You want rising productivity by doing more with less. This is what economists would mean by this, not by underpricing, not making foreigners better off. I mean, why do you want to make foreigners better off by selling? Imagine you go home and you tell your parents or your wife or your friends, you say, our household, our company, we should sell for much lower prices than we can, and we accept to pay higher prices for everything we buy. Well, your company would go bankrupt, your mother would throw you out of the house, your wife would divorce you. But PhDs in economics get away with telling governments that this is a good idea for countries. Adam Smith also pointed out what is folly for a household or an individual cannot be different for a country, and he was quite right in that regard. So what you would require is more fixed capital formation to boost productive capacity, and that doesn't come from the printing press or from boosting liquidity into banks and credit. Gains in productivity come from good institutions, but this is why they turn to the central banks, because politicians have weak incentives to do the right thing. In fact, democracy creates incentives for politicians to do the wrong thing, which is primarily redistribute and create obstructions to trade. So if you improve enforcement of contracts to increase legal certainty, this is no doubt a problem in most developing economies. If you look at the Doing Business report, you'll see the evidence of that. Reduce labor market rigidities. So these are where the real obstacles tend to be in economies, not in the exchange rate per se. So induced depreciation doesn't lead to net benefits. It primarily impacts on the export sector. If you gain additional foreign exchange, but you have less real wealth because you'll receive fewer imports for the amount of exports you sell, then you're actually worse off as a country. So receiving less for what is sold and paying more for what is bought is a decline in overall living standards. It would be the same for a household or a company as it is for a country. So central banks money is not the root of all evil. central banks are the root of all evil. That is, central banks that oversee a monopoly on the issue of a currency that's defined as a legal tender. It's a much longer statement, but this is what we need to understand. So central banks are not the savior. They're actually more likely to be the villain because of this immoral income transfers from the poorest towards the richest or from one sector to another. And the savers in the local currency. When I grew up, saving was a virtue. It's virtuous activities. Since John Maynard Keynes came along and the ideas of the paradox of thrift and all this other economic fallacies, it's fallen into disrepute. So this is why central bankers have no qualms about zero or negative interest rates because they believe in this crazy paradox of thrift. So also we see increased debt burdens from all of this. That's a totally different topic. So let's kill some economic zombies here. Thank you very much. And we'll
Thank you, Dr. Cris. I think that sets the tone for the discussion. I now invite Dr. Ajay Shah to make some opening remarks.
I thank the organizers. You have been getting lots of difficult material post-lunch, so I shall keep this very short, and I have only one piece of interesting commentary to add to the two excellent talks. I want to go once again to the basics and the foundations of the logic about how countries make these choices. There is one choice hiding somewhere in this background which has not been dealt with by the two speakers, which is the question of capital controls. Okay, so every now and then you will get proposals. There are countries where the idea is that we will use the coercive power of the government to cut off the people inside a country from being able to freely allocate capital all over the world. Okay, and I want to alert everybody in the room that this is coercion, this is reducing the choices of people inside the country, and that's not necessarily a very wise thing. We are directly reducing everybody's financial planning because you are forced to be undiversified. Okay, that if there is a person in Sri Lanka, if there is a person in Guatemala who is constrained to hold financial assets only within one country, then that harms the risk-reward trade-off. Okay, if the same person is able to hold portfolios all over the world, then there is a risk reduction of about half, and that's a free lunch. And when governments coerce people to only stay inside a country, we are using the coercive power of the government to reduce the happiness and welfare of persons inside the country. So that's one decision process in public policy that needs to be remarked upon, and that links integrally to the currencies question. Okay, so my personal view is that you should not interfere with coercive power in the capital account. My view is also that if you try to interfere in the capital account, it doesn't work too well because money is too easy to move around. Okay, every importer, every exporter is able to do over-invoicing and under-invoicing, and the capital finds its way to move around the globe. So you instead get a whole government machinery of inspectors and raids and courts and all sorts of attempts at trying to enforce capital controls, but these things never really work too well. Okay, so I would argue that you're better off having an open capital account and full freedom for people to move money in and out of the country. I think that's a better way to organize society. Okay, once you do that, there is a beautiful result that he implicitly had in the slides, but I would like to restate explicitly that there are three pieces of what is called the impossible trinity. Okay, and every country can only have two. Okay, and it's a beautiful toolkit, and it's worth understanding it. The first is an open capital account. The second is control of your own exchange rate. And the third is control of your own monetary policy. Okay? And I'm saying that let's rule out capital controls. So closing down the capital account is not a meaningful choice. It's not a feasible or useful choice in the modern world. Then after that, you're down to the other two. And then if you choose one, the other gives. If you choose to have a monetary policy that reflects local business cycle conditions, and you cannot control the exchange rate. If you control the exchange rate, then you cannot vary local interest rates in a way that will suit local monetary policy. So this is the kind of logic that every country has to go through. Okay? There is merit in choosing either of the corners. So now let me talk through a Hong Kong answer. Why was it wise and efficient for Hong Kong to choose a currency board? It's a city economy. Its tradables basket is almost the same as its CPI. By stabilizing the exchange rate, you end up stabilizing inflation. And so you get one corner of the impossible trinity. They have an open capital account, they have a fixed exchange rate, and in return, they've lost the ability to vary monetary policy based on local economic conditions. Okay, that's a call that Hong Kong has made. It has its own logic, and it's not wrong. It's an internally stable system, as long as you have the political ability to cold-bloodedly hang on to the currency board, even under stressful times. Okay, and as counterexample, you have Argentina, where the political system cracked when the currency board came under stress. The currency board is a clean idea in its own way, but it's really a challenge to the political system. That are we able to have a political system that will be able to coldly see through tough times? And then it's a stable system, it works. Okay, so the impossible trinity is a beautiful and valuable part of our toolkit. And somewhere inside our thinking, all of us need to think more about capital controls and the difficulties of countries that have tried to introduce capital controls. Okay, so I'll stop here and let's talk about more practical things that Murtaza will bring up.